And I might have to call the union.
You have to call the union on the back end if you go past the service line. Yes.
You know, the guys in the dock here are Teamsters. Yeah, I thought you probably knew.
Because this is, after all, the great city of Chicago.
I think I teach you.
With the Teamsters.
Yeah.
The IBW.
Yes. Sorry.
What does the Lucky Mojo doll look like?
We're standing up and taking a barrel. That would be. It's true.
It makes me want to order a copy.
Right.
You got the Amazon for that?
Yeah, as I say, I found the graphic on the web. I know nothing about it.
Well, you know, when Rage Boy uses graphics, he knows what he's talking about.
That's true. Great point.
Have you been following the latest incarnation?
Yeah.
How do I get that gig, though? I mean, yeah, think about it.
Take a lot of lithium.
Are you ready?
We are. We're ready. Okay. Hi. Welcome to the Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back of CALI presentations, or at least it would be if I had hair. I'm Tom Bruce. I run a small operation called the Legal Information Institute.
I'm John Haywood. I'm from American University.
And we're going to say a few things about mod rewrite, or actually John is, and I'm going to cheerlead, and then John is going to get into the technical specifics. What the heck is mod rewrite, and why would you want to use it? It's what I would call a nearly standard Apache module, which is to say it comes standard with the distribution, and typically Linux distributions that include Apache will also include mod rewrite and load it automatically, so that it's really not an awful lot of hassle to install the thing. You probably have it already if you're running Apache under Linux. As for Apache under Windows, I really couldn't say.
Elmer shaking his head yes.
It's a tool for URL rewriting. It lets you take URLs that come into the server and turn them into other URLs. Something which you could also think of as namespace translation. Putting things that are in one sort of web namespace into another within your site, which is a pretty simple idea that has some pretty powerful effects, as we'll see. Finally, it's something that offers significant advantages in performance over CGI-based approaches that do the same thing. Any of you who are writing little glue scripts that take URLs in and pump redirects out probably want to take a look at this as a much higher performance way of doing the same thing. I don't have any really specific statistics to offer, but in one rather overloaded situation that we underwent last fall, we found that at high hit rates, moving from a CGI-based redirect to using mod rewrite saved us something on the order of 5, count them 5 load average points on a creaking Linux server. So it's actually worth quite a bit. It's a good deal faster and less compute intensive than doing it through CGI. Some typical applications that you might try to do with this thing, I will talk about them. John will do some nuts and bolts illustration, then we'll go back and look at actual syntax that implements some of these. Rearranging file systems, right? We moved some stuff on the website. It used to be in /some/location, and now it's in /some/other/location. So what do we do? Mod rewrite is a way of solving that problem without all of your old URLs breaking on all of the sites that point to you. Doing highly selective complex redirection, where you don't want to redirect everybody, or you want to redirect people in ways that are kind of situation or browser specific. One obvious example is browser specific redirection. Make all the Mozilla people look at this one, and all the Firefox people look at that one, and all of the Internet Explorer people look at nothing at all. One can also do host-specific redirection or refer-specific redirection. Every once in a while in my life, it happens that somebody out there decides that a cheap way to develop content for their website is to frame mine. This tends to annoy me, particularly when they do it without attribution, and we will install redirection stuff that detects where the hit is coming from, and if it's a framer, they get a message that says, you might want to be aware that you can get this directly from the people who wrote it at the following URL. We find that this discourages framers a lot. Search engine back compatibility. We've been putting searchable legal information on the web for 13 years now. That means that we've been through something like 6 generations of search engine, all of which used different parameters, database names, syntax, et cetera, for query links coming in. Because we and other people tend to freeze query links as a kind of, sort of frozen captive search that they use to recover certain kinds of material. We don't want to break all of those, so that every time we switch search engines, we end up doing a furious amount of mod rewrite activity to translate the old URLs into something that will work with produce the same result for the new search engine. Head compatible addresses versus semantics-free identifiers. Lots of things by design put URLs on your content that are meant to be completely void of semantic information. Good example that Ben was pointing out to me yesterday are things like content management systems that tend to identify chunks of HTML or web pages using identifiers that strongly resemble your vehicle identification number. But basically have no meaning in the real world. Things like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You would really like that URL for the benefit of people who are coming into the site to say something clear like, blah, blah, blah.yourschool.edu/admissions, as opposed to blah, blah, blah.yourschool.edu/123.7a64.g. And so mod rewrite offers you a way of making head-compatible namespaces out of things that are basically semantics free. Other times, this is not imposed on you by something like a content management system, but you decide that for one reason or another, it's safer for you to organize your content in a way that simply is serialized without any semantics being applied by the file names or what have you. But on the other hand, you want the files to be accessible via some well-known namespace scheme like citation, like legal citation. So it's good in that situation. Okay, so far? We're infinitely interruptible here.
Yes.
And highly interactive.
And now we will completely confuse you. Please immediately. Voodoo logic, mod rewrite and its techniques. Rewrite can be real simple, and it can be real complex. It can be both. The simple stuff is basic one-rule rewrites of URLs. An example of that in a bit. The complex ones are very nested conditional statements and map statements and loops back, and it can really get annoyingly complex. There are 2 contexts available, which is kind of per server. So you put it on the server or the vhost, and it processes at the beginning of the URL string. You can also do it per directory. You can put it in the htaccess file. The problem with that one is that the way the way the rewrite engine works is it goes through everything and then hits the file namespace. It processes everything it can. Then it goes to the file namespace and starts going through the directories. And so it's at the very end. And it's very, very, very inefficient and really slow. Stop doing it. Rule order is really important. The order of the rules that you put in your conf file or your htaccess file. The rewriting engine loops through by rewrite rule. Rewrite rule is a directive, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it uses the rewrite rule order for how it goes through and processes an URL. When it finds a rewrite rule, a particular rule that matches, it will then loop through rewrite conditional statements, if you have any.
This will all make much more sense in a minute when you
It will.
see some actual examples.
It
We
will.
thought we'd scare you to death first.
For some reason, well, actually not for some reason, because it looks better when you're looking at it as a human being looking at the file, rewrite conditions are put in front of rewrite rules. The processor actually does it the opposite. It hits the rule and then goes back to the rewrite condition, which if you don't understand that when you try to start doing this, it can be really confusing. The control flow. A lovely little diagram. Can you guys see that? It's a lovely little diagram that we pulled off of the only real documentation for mod rewrite, which is in the Apache.org site. The URL is matched first. Thank you, Tom. Is matched first against the first rule's pattern, the first rule that it reads. In this case, it fails. Okay, it doesn't match the pattern. It then moves to the next URL rule, skipping any conditions, anything. It goes straight to the rule, matches to that pattern. In this case, it matches the pattern. So it then goes back up and looks through conditions. It scrolls through the conditions top to bottom. If there are no conditions, it just substitutes the string, the substitution string for the rewrite rule, which we'll get to when we get to it. If there are any conditions, it creates a test string and tests that against the pattern, the condition pattern. Processed in the ordered listed. If the pattern doesn't match, if things don't match, the complete set of rewrite conditionals, the corresponding rewrite rule fails. So if you've got a whole bunch of conditions, and it matches, say you have 4 conditions, and it goes through and matches 3 of them, and fails on the 4th, the whole rule fails, and you go to the next rule. This will become, I think, a little bit more obvious when we look at actual examples. If the pattern matches, it goes to the next condition. Once they all match, the URL is rewritten, and the next rule is processed. You can use an OR flag at the end of the rewrite conditional, which takes out the implicit and, it puts an OR in to make it so you don't have to write the same thing 3 or 4 times. It comes in handy. The directives. There are a bunch of directives. There are 4 that I use. I don't know if you use more than that. The rewrite rule directive is the first one. It's the most important one because it's the one that actually does a rewrite. Rewrite conditional sets up conditional statements. Rewrite log and rewrite log level are actually 2 separate directives. Very important for debugging. You have to set the log level up fairly high. Figure out what's going on. Because I guarantee you, when you write a rewrite rule, you will fail. It will take you a couple times. I think this is probably a good point to say, don't do this on a production box.
Or don't test it on
Yeah, don't test it on a production box. Do it on a development box. Do it on your own desktop. Do it somewhere else so that you don't segfault the server. Or, if you set your log level really high, you max out all your drive space.
Unless Dan Nagy is your system administrator, in which case he'll clean up after you.
Exactly. And rewrite map, which Tom will go into greatly. He does some actually fairly cool stuff with transposition. Okay, the rewrite rule. Here's the syntax. Rewrite rule, pattern, substitution, and flags. The one I've done here is actually something I did for the folks at Pepperdine. They had a Tomcat server. They had a Java server sorting script that they wanted to hide. They wanted to hide from the URL from it, the rewrite one. So they grabbed anything that ended in .jsp. That's a regular expression. You guys all, I don't have to learn a regular expression. Okay, good. Grabbed every JSP, rewrote it, passed it, appended stuff onto the query string and passed it through and processed it. It works actually pretty well. You said the stuff in green is the regex pattern. The stuff in blue is the substitution string, which is substituted for the pattern and or for the URL. And the flags, QSA, is query system append. It packs stuff onto the end, and PT, which is passed through. Okay, let's go through the pattern. It's a regex. That just is my favorite regex. for whatever reason. Mod rewrite is supposedly Perl compatible. We like to say it's mostly Perlish. There are a few incompatibilities. The one that bit me was negation in Perl. You negate with an exclamation point and an equal sign. In mod rewrite, you just use an exclamation point.
It's just a nonsense.
Yeah. You know, you put together a regex, you think it'll work, and it fails, and it keeps failing. You can't figure out what the problem is. I put it onto my Perl box, and just ran it under Perl, and it passed. Everything worked. I couldn't figure it out until I finally actually went and read the documentation, which is, of course, always the last resort. The substitution part allows back references, but not just back references to the rewrite rule. You can also back reference the last matched rewrite condition.
We'll see an example of that later on.
0 through 9, and for some reason the rewrite condition is 1 through 9. Different counting ways.
This is actually one of these things that has a tendency to bite you when you're doing this for real, which is that you use one syntax thinking you're getting a back reference to the rewrite pattern, but in fact you've gone back to the conditional statement before it. It's also, and the last match conditional pattern at that.
Yeah.
It's also possible to screw up in that way. So this is where it gets a little confusing.
This is where I think the phrase serious voodoo comes to mind. A lot of it is you just keep plugging away at it until you get something to work.
Often not what you intended.
Often not what you intended. Server variables can be matched. You know, HTTP headers, server, and all kinds of stuff. There's a list of. We were going to put it on a slide, but we thought that would be a little ridiculous.
There's a list of maybe 25 of them. For conceptual purposes, it's basically equivalent to all of the server variable stuff that gets passed into the CGI environment, which we're all familiar with. So it extends that a little bit.
Not by much, though. And mapping function calls, which are done with a map name and then a key and an optional default. We'll get into it a little bit. Okay, the flags. There's 16 of them. I've only used a few, very few. QSA allows you to tax up. You're rewriting the URL. You're not rewriting the query string. If you want to add stuff to the query string, you have to use the QSA flag to add stuff and subtract stuff. NC, if you've got case problems. Chaining the rule. You can chain rules together so that if one fails, it skips any chain rule. So if you have 4 rules and you chain the first 3, if the first rule fails, it goes to rule 4. It skips all the ones that are chained. You can set an environment variable, which can come in really handy. Those are the ones the only ones I've used. Well, there's 2 I didn't put on here, which is last and next, which allow you to, next allows you to start the entire rewrite rule process on, not on the original URI, but on what you've got at the end. And L allows you to stop the rewriting process completely right at that statement. If this condition is met, you cut it. Okay, rewrite conditions. The syntax, very similar. There's a test string, a condition pattern, and a flag. The test string, you can put anything into. You can expand variables. You can expand back traces. Very flexible. In this case, in the example here, I'm using the query string. I want to test stuff against it. In this case, I'm doing a particular database identifier. If it meets that, I want it to trigger the condition. Works fairly well in NC because I've had some case problems in the file naming system for a while. Go there. The test string. Back references to the last match rewrite condition pattern. Back references to the following rewrite rule pattern. You can do server variables, and of course you can do mapping function calls, just like you can do in a rewrite rule. The condition pattern. It's a Perl compatible regex, mostly. And there are many special variants, which to be honest, I haven't really used. Have you?
I've never have really had any fault.
The condition pattern, the greater than, lesser than, and equal condition patterns has something to do with lexical order, which since I haven't had to use it, I haven't really done much with it. You can test the directory and file. You can test whether the URI, whether you're going for a file that actually exists. Does this file exist with a size greater than 0, which is important, or is this file available in the namespace? I suppose that could come in handy for something too, for nothing I do, and push the negate at all.
This Procon with some content management systems. They will
Ah.
look at the file system to see if an actual file exists. If it does, it will serve it. If not, then it will use rewrite to go into the content management system.
Sure.
Gotcha.
That makes sense.
Gotcha.
Okay, so it could be very useful.
So it's a cheap way of doing inheritance, basically.
Yeah. Okay, flags. There are only 2 flags with rewrite conditions: case insensitive, no case, or next condition, which lets you get out of the implicit and. Rewrite conditional statements are implicitly linked with an and. You can substitute it more, which can come in handy. Rewrite log and log level. Very simple syntax. Rewrite log in the file path to your log. Rewrite log level and a level number from 0 to 9. I wouldn't advise 9 unless you have terabytes of space. Well, not quite. 0 means no logging. 9 means they're logging everything, including things that aren't happening on your server.
The caution is justified. I mean, I've used this to try to debug stuff on running production servers, and it has a terrible tendency to flatline disks very quickly because it generates an incredible amount of nonsense. Because it's telling you what it's doing every step of the conditional pattern match and so forth and so on, particularly at the higher logging numbers. It's extremely useful for debugging, but again, it's a good reason not to try to do this on anything that's actually running production, but to do it on a test server at relatively low volumes, because it will generate an amazing amount of stuff in no time.
I usually start at a fairly low number and then work my way up numbers until I solve the problem. Let's see what else we have here. For debugging, it's essential. The more you log, the slower your server. Again, 2 is, I think, about the most for a production server. Rewrite map. Syntax is rewrite map, map name, map type, map source. You call it in either a rewrite rule or a rewrite conditional, and that's what they look like when you're calling them. What they do is, map name is whatever name you give it. There are 5 types of map types. 5 types of maps, whatever. Plain text, randomized plain text, hash file, internal function, and external program. We'll go through all 5. And map source is the file system path to the map file name.
Basically, the idea here is that rewrite map is a kind of Swiss Army knife for any kind of URL substitution you want to do that you can't strictly do on the basis of pattern matching and substitution, either because you're trying to map from one kind of arbitrary namespace to another arbitrary namespace that has nothing to do with it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oink, bow, wow, moo, right? Or because you need external database lookups in order to do it, or. It's just generally meant for any situation in which simple pattern matching and substitution isn't going to do it for you. If we get time at the end of the show here, I'll talk about what I think is actually a better way to accomplish this, because I've always had a lot of trouble with rewrite map, but maybe that's because I can't code. So.
In this particular one, the sample up there, it's rewrite map, boy, text saying that it's a text, standard plain text map, and then a file path to the file name for the text file. The text file is at the bottom. The matching key is catalog. The rewrite is def registrar HTML AY 2005. So you've got the catalog, the course catalog for your students and faculty and whoever is actually in a logical directory structure for your site, but instead of having somebody write all that junk in to their browser, you just have them write catalog. And it can grab it and map it. Other types of maps. Randomized plain text, which allows you to do a little bit of the only time I've ever seen it used is for, in this example, load balancing on web servers. If it's static, it goes to one of these 4. If it's dynamic, it goes to one of these 2. I haven't done much of a video. Hash files, binary DBM file containing the same contents as a plain text file, optimized for really fast lookups. I don't have that kind of traffic to ever need that. Even you guys don't do. And internal Apache functions, which can be useful. You're limited to the 4 that come with Apache. 2 upper, 2 lower, escape and unescape allows you to do, rapid changes from uppercase to lowercase, and hex encoding, nifty special characters. Again, the same basic function. It's although instead of a path name, it's just a function name at the end of the directive. External rewriting programs. If you want to send it, particularly something matches, you want to send it to an external rewriting program, something you've written, CGI. You can do this. There are some problems with this approach. One thing, you can't buffer input-output. And if you're using Perl, that can be a bit of a problem.
Just buffered by default.
And you have to unbuffer. And there's no communication sync with the external program, so you have to lock things.
I have to say that as a practical matter, before I tried using an external program as part of a rewrite map, I've never had very good luck with it. I've had problems with I/O buffering. I've had trouble with the thing SIG faulting the server for no apparent reason, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Translation handlers are actually a much cleaner way to do this if you've got mod Perl installed and a little bit faster to boot. So, frankly, if you're running an Apache setup that does have mod Perl, I wouldn't monkey with this because I think it's just going to lead to trouble.
And we don't want trouble. And now it is yours.
So here are some real-world examples plucked directly from the Apache configuration files of the Legal Information Institute. This is a working system, actually, for a gateway questionnaire, or in this case, a fundraising page. So anyone who comes into the states directory, somebody who comes into the states subdirectory in our web tree gets looked at to see, first of all, if they're holding a cookie called LII donor OK. If they're not, we check to see if their user agent contains the string link checker, which means it's our internal link checking software and should be passed anyway. And if both of those conditions are true, because remember, when you stack these, they're implicitly ANDed. So I ain't got a cookie, I'm not the link checker, okay, I'm going to get rewritten. And I'm going to get rewritten in such a way that I get sent to a page called donors/solicit.php with a parameter following that actually contains my original URL. The reason being that once this person is through giving us money, which is actually what this does, we want to pass them on to their original destination. So they go through the fundraising process, and then they're sent happily on to where they meant to go all along, minus their $5 or $10 or $3,000 or whatever. So you can do the same thing with questionnaires. Many of you, I'm sure, have looked at stuff like the Washington Post site, where every 90 days or so they ask you 3 questions about your demographic before they'll let you look at you. It's a very typical way to implement that kind of stuff, and it's very clean, provided that your script that's actually doing the soliciting or the questionnaire or what have you then sets the cookie to say, okay, this person completed it, let's not bother them again. And of course, variations that one can do with that are setting the expiration date on the cookie so they get bothered every so often, or their bothering gets deferred until tomorrow, or what have you. It's one practical use for doing a sort of cookie-based selective redirect. Search engine back compatibility, I talked about that earlier. This works with a new type of search engine to do some things with an old type of search engine. So, first of all, we don't do this unless it's a GET request. That's just a cheap way of keeping a lot of traffic out of the remaining conditions. So we look at the query string, and if it's of a form that contains the string db equals topics, which tells us that it's an old-style search engine URL looking for the topics database, with a parameter called query00, which is one that the old search engine took. Then we rewrite it, and this line break is actually an artifact of the slide. You wouldn't see that in the file. We actually rewrite that to look at a new search page passing the query in as a parameter, and that %3 back reference there is to this parenthesized parameter there. So essentially we're just taking an old style search engine syntax, rewriting it to something new. Makes sense? And please stop me at the point where this gets obscure or crazy. Yeah, you're right. We have much too into that. Here's an example of a sort of head-compatible address into a semantics-free identifier. We used to do, and still make available, I don't know if, in fact, if this is an actual reference, I just made this up for purposes of the slide. This would be a head-compatible reference to subtitle 4 of Title 18 in the United States Code. Right, nicely abbreviated as ST4, so that, you know, Joe Law Professor who's sitting there late at night, deeply desiring to point his class materials at the LII site, can just rattle this thing off without even thinking about it. Actually, that's not at all what we call the thing internally. It's got some weird serialized thing that looks like the VIN on Bill Gates' Porsche. So we rewrite this way. It goes through a whole stack of war conditions, looking to see if it's a subtitle type designator or a subchapter type designator or a subpart or a part or a chapter. And assuming that it's one of those things, it gets passed off, actually in this case to a CGI script, because at the time when I wrote this I was too dumb to know how to do a translation handler, so I'm passing it off to a CGI script. Again, with the appropriate back references plugged in as parameters for that CGI script. So this is actually getting the title number from the incoming URL that's parenthesized here, and a so-called supersection parameter that's based on what's bracketized here. The CGI script is actually what has the intelligence to do the database lookup and do the translation. Okay, let's talk about some drawbacks that this thing has, as if they weren't painfully obvious to all of us in the room at the moment. Voodoo syntax, right? I mean, this is not particularly easy stuff, and it's full of traps for the unwary. Probably the first thing that gets people is that URIs that you're seeing coming into that rewrite con or rewrite rule may not be what you think, because at the point where they come to mod rewrite, they've been partially cooked by the Apache software anyway. They're generally web root relative URIs without any server name or anything of that sort. So you may not be getting what you expect there. That causes a lot of confusion. As we've said, the regex syntax, although advertised as being Perl regular expression syntax, is not quite Perlish. There are minor differences. Some of that may be hallucination on our part. I have to confess that when John and I were trying to think of examples to use in the presentation, he came up with one, and then we scratched our head and said, well, I think there are more. I've been tripped by this before, but as you all know, that's the kind of hallucination that comes upon you when you're debugging something for much too long. In fact, this may be not as much of a problem as we're claiming that it is. The dual back reference thing is confusing. It's easy to do a %2 instead of a whatever the other $2, or a $2 when you should be doing a %2 or whatever. And it's also tough to remember that it matches the last rewrite conditional statement that was matched, rather than the one that is directly preceding the thing in the configuration file that you're editing at the time you're debugging the thing. Flags, as John showed you, implement an ungodly number of different sort of classes of functionality, and I don't think there's anyone living who understands more than, what more than 4 of those flags actually do. And they can have some rather bizarre and unpredictable effects. And finally, creating complex logic in this environment is actually really kind of hard, as you can see, because you've got all of the flexibility of how one thing chains to another, how things are stacked on top of one on top of another, and you can make some just ungodly messes in a very, very short period of time. My answer to that more recently, one last thing. This may be an advantage or a disadvantage, it depends. It's kind of a two-edged sword. you're redirecting. I mean, at the end of the day, what the browser, what the client is seeing coming at your site is a redirect. And so what that client will get and remember is the URL or the URI that it was redirected to. It's not completely opaque in that sense. The guy comes in looking for one URL and ends up clutching another one that you've fed back to him. If for some reason you really want that process to be completely opaque to the client, you need to be using translation handlers rather than this, because they will be getting what you feed and hanging on to it. And there are times when you may not want that. Finally, as we've said about 100 times, mapping scripts are a big headache to get right, and there are, to my way of thinking, easier ways to do it. Let's just take a quick peek. Actually, let's stop here for a second and look for questions on my rewrite, because I'll talk about translation handlers for a bit. We've obviously got time, if anyone wants us to, but in the meantime, I suspect there are questions. Yeah.
I'll probably do limited stuff with this, but probably the easiest thing that anybody would do if they sort of dabble with this is just get rid of that. Whenever you have a directory, you need that slash on the end.
Oh yeah,
that's the easiest one you can create, and it's probably something that everybody here probably has some issue with, unless they already know that. So if anybody wants to get introduced to it, that'd be the easiest thing to do it. It's an easy rule to create.
Yeah, the infamous trailing slash problem. Yeah. What do you do when you see the trailing slash versus something without the trailing slash, et cetera, et cetera? And actually, there's quite a good cookbook example of how to do that in the mod rewrite documentation.
Another thing you can do that's fairly easy to do, if you've got people with public HTML files in their user directories with the little tilde, and you want to get rid of the tilde, you can map that to a user space, which looks a lot nicer. It's a lot nicer to type in /user/a within tilde because that confuses people.
Yes.
I don't know if you know this, but is there anything for IIS, like something which IIS can use?
Anybody in this room knows more than I do about IIS.
I don't know much, but I do know there are ISAPI filters out there that you can plug into IIS that do exactly this, and actually they're not redirects, they do translation, and they do use quick questions a little bit with things.
Are they publicly available? Are they freeware sort of open source?
It's a combination. I haven't done a search recently, but there's several out there. Some are very inexpensive.
Anyone else? Okay. So let's look at translation handlers for a second. Translation handlers, and I'll show you an example in a moment if I can negotiate it on this machine. They're fairly simple to learn and use. They require that you not learn much syntax above and beyond Perl if you know some already. And they do have the full power and clarity of Perl. Now, you wouldn't have to write them in Perl. I just happen to write them that way. They can really be done in, I think, practically anything. But they're handiest if you're already running on Perl on the server and want to use that. Oops, that's you. So I'm going to escape out of this for a second. Open up a file. So, why is that? Windows needs to know everything about me. Open it with my unregistered copy of Edit Plus. I agree. This is an example of the sort of thing that one wants to avoid doing with a rewrite map. All of this stuff is a bunch of syntactic overhead that basically involves calling up our particular libraries for looking up US code sections on the one hand, and also getting a hold of some constant definitions that Apache uses internally. And what this thing does is basically take any URL that contains the magic string US code, and then depending on a number of other conditions, does an appropriate sort of lookup or rewrite of the URL based on what's in it to the new style thing. This particular section of the code right here is exactly the example I was showing you a minute ago of subtitle, subchapter, subpart, etc. translation, and so forth and so on. And as you can see, it's a little bit cleaner, it's a little bit easier to understand, and this thing handles an awful lot more than the actual mod rewrite based thing did. This is a little difficult example to try to work our way through. Let me see if I can summon up another one here that might be a little simpler. I have to say I wasn't sure we were going to get this far. Wasn't sure I wanted to do it. Yes. This one replaces about 75 lines of code for rewriting old search engine URLs to new ones based on the collection. Again, you've got very minimal overhead here that says, okay, I need some Apache constants. I want to be known as a package. The subroutine is always known as handler. Basically takes the incoming URI, looks at it, and says, okay, if you contain anything that's been parameterized as query 00 or key, which is the sign that you're from an old search engine, then if you belong to such and such and such and such a collection, the query looks like this and the database identifier looks like that, works its way down through that logic, appends the whole thing together, feeds the header out as a redirect, and goes on about its business. So in 10 lines there, you've got 80 lines of mod rewrite stuff pertaining to various collections and so forth and so on that runs at much more efficient. Without going into deep Perl syntax, that's really pretty much what there is to say about that. Question? I find that it's just an awful lot cleaner for doing big stuff. How do I operate PowerPoint? That's you.
We thought we'd throw up, documentation. The two versions, the two basic things are the mod rewrite documentation, module documentation, and there's a URL rewriting guide that's also on the same Apache site that's actually pretty good, fairly thorough. It can be a little confusing at times, and they're at Apache Docs 2.0. I use the 2.0 version of Apache. If you're using 1.3, there's the same thing as basically available there.
I don't think there's any change in the mod rewrite syntax from one version of Apache to the other. I think it's the same.
And then finally, we thought we should pay homage to the guy who wrote it, Ralph Ingleshaw.
It's probably the worst picture.
The cheesiest photo I've ever seen on the web. But that's him. Anyway, that's that.
So, we're done. Have you got anything to say? Hearing no questions. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Still,
Right. Right, exactly. Yeah. Right. Right. And would have been blood. What is that right next to that field?
Oh, be or not. I converted one.
Yeah. No. I like their stuff. Taking several of their courses. Oh, are you? Yeah, that's this. Have you taken the course yet?
I took the course, yeah, now I have to take the test.
Yeah. No, but the test is not. You have to do practical for that too, correct?
Not anymore.
Oh, really?
They dropped the practical.
Oh, wow, he's out.
Yeah, I was the first class that they dropped.
They got the practical for him?
Yeah, we did the
In character based. Capture all that.
I know, I took it last February and bought an extension for my practical.
So you're basically going to come in and
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Yeah, it'll just be well, it's not the whole defensive test thing. The initial philosophy of defensive test, and then it'll be some practical stuff to go along with
The
it.
guy had.
A lot of confusion over IDS and IPS.
Those are out there?
Homer asked me to give you the basic, so the basic concept of defensive test stuff, and then context.
The vendor area, double chocolate. Yeah, they done one point.
Huh? Not an ice cream. I feel like it's a.
so much ahead of us. Well, I started spring. So, but also, racketing around here. All of which I have. I don't want to find I have no idea. Here's why it's happening. Another one is not. Well, I mean, if you grant it was I can do it. Pearl says 5 or 6. All of them. I would find all publications. Yeah, this that use metadata as being at least the most productive. At that point, one of the things. Well, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, that's I think is actually your answer. There isn't, and I'm not going to find it, so I'm going to have to create the metadata for doing things to put it in the repository. I wanted to go to this SSRN and screen it down because it's not publicly available. But I can't actually get to that. I've been out since 2000, so I don't know.
Technically, yes, I have to. Yes, I will. Yeah. You're here. Are you?
See, that's the thing. It's like we could have created this for faculty on our own. I know. This was one of the things John and I were discussing. Now, SSRN came along, everybody's not doing SSRN. Moving it to public health. What I find interesting, you assume that but then you don't add any data. So another place your name shows up is inside of the computer. And if you put it in there, maybe we should do AI. Which would be chance to be found.
You got problems.
It's required.
Just for you to like what you look like you had. So that's what actually we have the hour. We don't have Oh, okay. Yeah.
me about it.
Yeah, exactly. So they solicit light, so like the little boy on my street.
So Title 42. They're 42.
Back to the
And they're not United States.
all the benefits are just.
They was Kelmer for years. And then it's not last or an 18, so it was $500 yeah, but they're not very yeah, they get 5 years of ours and stuff.
I just bought a power SC model. And I buy a new brake.
I think I passed.
Onboard rate of
Yeah.
See, they're all hiding up against the back wall, so I can't.
Yeah, that's that. How much are you?
Celeron process.
I need help. Celeron?
Wrong.
Server for $300. Right, yeah. We're going to find squirrels now.
How we can love server in my house is running like well, I mean, or let me do it this way. I can make a schema from my USB, but suppose I just flashlight. Because I thought it looks like you're supposed to be able to control it out. The gold prototype of it. But I've never tried it. So the fact that I hide myself this thing. But okay. Well, it's not doing it. Done a lot of them actually.